There are wars that end, and then there are the things done during wars that never quite finish, that linger in classified folders, in the memories of men who signed documents promising silence, in the bodies of people who never understood what was being done to them. After 1945, the victorious powers sat down and drew lines. Lines around territories, lines around crimes, lines around what the world was allowed to know. Some of those lines were drawn not to protect civilians, but to protect secrets, to preserve knowledge that had been purchased at an unconscionable price, knowledge extracted from human beings who had no choice, knowledge that certain governments decided was too valuable to destroy, too dangerous to reveal, and too shameful to ever properly explain. What you are about to hear is not speculation. These are documented programs, some partially declassified, some acknowledged only after decades of denial, some still only partially understood. These are the experiments that powerful nations tried to erase, not because they failed, but because some of them worked. In the winter of 1941, as the German advance into the Soviet Union stalled in temperatures that plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius, the Luftwaffe discovered a problem it had not anticipated. Pilots shot down over the Eastern Front were dying not from enemy fire but from cold. Specifically, they were dying after rescue, when their bodies, having been exposed to freezing water or Arctic air for extended periods, were rewarmed by well-meaning medics using methods that, it turned out, accelerated cardiac failure rather than prevented it. The official protocol was standard friction rewarming, rubbing the body, applying blankets, generating heat through movement. Doctors believed this was the correct response. The medical establishment of the time considered it settled science. It was not. Dr. Sigmund Rascher, a Luftwaffe physician stationed at Dachau concentration camp, proposed to find out what actually happened to the human body in extreme cold, and more importantly, how to bring it back. The problem he identified was real. The method he chose to investigate it was among the most deliberately cruel ever sanctioned by a modern government. Prisoners were submerged in tanks of ice water. Some were dressed in Luftwaffe flight suits. Some wore nothing at all. Rascher and his team measured core body temperature by inserting instruments into the stomach and rectum. They recorded the precise point at which consciousness was lost. They recorded the precise point at which the heart stopped. They did this with hundreds of human beings, methodically while taking notes. The rewarming experiments that followed were equally systematic and equally lethal. Prisoners were placed beside open fires. They were placed in baths of hot water at varying temperatures. In some of the most disturbing documented sessions, Rascher attempted rewarming through body heat, forcing female prisoners to lie with the near-frozen subjects to test whether human contact could restore core temperature more effectively than mechanical methods. Rascher reported his findings directly to Heinrich Himmler, who requested regular updates with evident enthusiasm. But here is where the story fractures into something morally unbearable. Some of his findings about cold exposure and the dangers of rapid rewarming were not wrong. The physiological observations, stripped of their context and their cost, contained data that post-war researchers found themselves unable to simply discard. After the war, Rascher's records were captured, and a debate began in the medical community that has never fully been resolved. Some physicians argued that using data derived from torture was itself a form of complicity, that to cite the findings was to retroactively justify the method. Others argued that refusing to use information that might save lives was its own moral failure. The data existed. The people who generated it were dead, and the nations that won the war found themselves holding knowledge soaked in atrocity, wondering what to do with it. To this day, the question has not been definitively answered. The cold was real, the suffering was real, and somewhere in the silence between those two facts, a question sits that medicine has never fully resolved. In 1943, a German scientist named Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, and a man of erratic and often brutal impulses, began funding research into what was described in internal documents as acoustic weapons. The concept was not new. Military theorists had long speculated about the possibility of using sound itself as a weapon. Not explosive sound, not the concussive wave of a bomb, but sustained, targeted low-frequency sound that could disorient, incapacitate, or psychologically destroy enemy combatants. The research drew on a known phenomenon, infrasound. Sound frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, below 20 Hertz, cannot be perceived consciously, but they are felt. They resonate in the chest cavity. They interfere with visual processing. At sufficient intensity, they produce sensations of profound unease, of dread, of a presence that cannot be located or explained. Some researchers had linked infrasound to reports of haunted locations, old buildings where pipes or wind created standing waves that induced panic in occupants who could not identify the source. The German program attempted to weaponize this effect. Large rotating parabolic dishes were constructed, some mounted on vehicles, designed to generate and focus infrasonic waves toward enemy positions. The projected outcome was that soldiers exposed to the device would experience confusion, loss of fine motor control, involuntary defecation, and psychological terror intense enough to rout entire units without a single conventional shot being fired. Testing was conducted. The results, according to the fragmentary documents that survived, were mixed at best. The devices worked in the sense that they produced measurable physiological effects at close range. They did not work at the distances needed for battlefield application. They were cumbersome, fragile, and required power supplies that the mobile German army could not reliably provide. The program was quietly suspended. But when Allied forces swept through Germany in the final months of the war, teams of scientists, many of them working under what would later become Operation Paperclip, catalogued everything. The acoustic research was among the material collected. What followed is where the record grows thin. American and British military programs in the post-war years included documented investigations into low-frequency acoustic effects on human subjects. Some of this research was connected to crowd control. Some was framed as defensive, understanding what the Soviets might develop. Some of it remains classified to a degree that prevents independent verification. What is documented is this: the effects of sustained infrasound on human cognitive and emotional function were studied methodically for decades after the war. The German research did not die in 1945. It was absorbed. It was continued under new flags and new institutional names. Whether any of it was ever used operationally is a question that official records do not clearly answer, and some of the researchers who might have known are no longer alive to say. In 1943, the United States Chemical Warfare Service faced a problem of extraordinary delicacy. It needed to test the effectiveness of chemical protective equipment on human subjects under realistic conditions. The problem was obvious. You cannot expose volunteers to lethal chemical agents without accepting that some of them may die. And you cannot extract meaningful data from simulations that do not involve actual exposure. The solution the Chemical Warfare Service arrived at was to use American military personnel, predominantly enlisted men, and disproportionately men of color, who were told they were participating in studies of summer clothing or new uniforms, or simply given orders to report for testing without explanation. At facilities including Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland and installations in the Caribbean, thousands of American soldiers were exposed to mustard gas and lewisite, blister agents capable of destroying lung tissue, burning skin to the bone, and causing long-term carcinogenic damage, without being told what they were being exposed to, without being given the option to refuse, and in many cases without receiving any medical follow-up. The racial dimensions of the program were deliberate and documented. Research teams specifically tested whether African American and Puerto Rican soldiers had different physiological responses to chemical agents than white soldiers, a question rooted in the pseudoscientific racism that pervaded military and medical institutions of the era. Black soldiers were used as comparison groups in experiments designed, in part, to determine whether certain populations could be equipped with lighter protective equipment if they were presumed to be more or less susceptible to chemical injury. The results, such as they were, showed no meaningful difference. The question had been asked in service of a racist assumption that the data did not support. But the men who had been used to answer it received no acknowledgement, no compensation, and in many cases no medical care for the chronic conditions they developed as a result of their exposure. The program remained classified for decades. Veterans who tried to access their own medical records were told the records did not exist. Some were told they had never participated in any experiment at all. The full truth did not emerge until the 1990s, when the Department of Veterans Affairs was finally forced to acknowledge the program's existence. Compensation was made available for those still living. By that point, many were not. Think carefully about what that means. The men who protected their country were protected from nothing. Not from gas, not from silence, not from the indignity of being used as instruments and then discarded. They wore the uniform. They followed the orders, and the institution they served spent 50 years pretending it had never happened. What would you have done if you had been one of those men, and only decades later learned what had really been in the chamber? Long before MKUltra became a household word in the 1970s, its conceptual roots were growing in wartime soil. The question that certain intelligence agencies began asking during the Second World War was deceptively simple. Could a human being's will be overcome? Not through torture, which produced unreliable confessions and broke the subject in ways that made them operationally useless, but through chemistry, through psychology, through the systematic dismantling of the self. The Germans had their own version of this inquiry. Documents recovered after the war described experiments at Dachau involving mescaline, the psychoactive compound derived from peyote, administered to prisoners under interrogation. The goal was to determine whether the drug could eliminate resistance, whether it could make a man tell the truth involuntarily, whether, in other words, consciousness itself could be chemically unlocked. The results were, by the Germans' own documentation, inconclusive. Some subjects became confused and malleable. Others became paranoid and uncommunicative. The drug did not produce reliable truth. It produced chaos, which was not the same thing, but the concept did not die. When American intelligence officers reviewed the Dachau files, they did not discard the research question. They kept it. They brought German scientists, men who had participated in some of these studies, to the United States under programs designed to extract scientific value from people who might otherwise have faced prosecution. The wartime chemical interrogation research fed directly into post-war programs that used American citizens, mental patients, prisoners, and soldiers as unwitting subjects. LSD was administered without consent. Sensory deprivation was used for days at a time. Hypnosis was combined with drug exposure in attempts to create what some documents described as programmed behavior, the possibility of a human being who could be given instructions they would not consciously remember receiving. Much of this research was ordered destroyed in 1973 when its existence became politically untenable. The destruction was not complete. Enough survived, enough invoices, enough memos, enough secondary records to piece together the outline of what had been done. The wartime experiments in Germany were the seed. The post-war programs were the harvest, and between them stretched a line of continuity that the official history of the war preferred not to draw. If you've made it this far, what comes next is not easier. These are the entries that even historians approach with deliberate care. The programs that follow were not fringe operations. They were institutionally sanctioned, scientifically conducted, and, in some cases, their results were considered valuable enough to preserve long after the methods that produced them were officially condemned. Unit 731. The name is known. What is less understood is the full institutional scope of what it represented, and what happened to its findings after the war ended. The Imperial Japanese Army's Covert Biological and Chemical Warfare Research Unit, operating primarily in Manchuria, conducted experiments on prisoners of war and civilian captives that were, in terms of deliberate human suffering, without parallel in the documented history of military medicine. Subjects, referred to internally as maruta, meaning logs, were infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. They were subjected to pressure experiments designed to determine at what atmospheric pressure the human eyeball would be forced from its socket. They underwent vivisection, surgery performed while conscious and without anesthesia, so that researchers could observe the progression of infection through living tissue without the confounding variable of chemical intervention. Frostbite experiments echoed what Rascher was doing in Germany simultaneously. Weapons testing used human beings as targets to measure blast radius, shrapnel dispersal, and the efficacy of biological delivery systems. The scale was enormous. Estimates of the total number of people killed in Unit 731's research programs range from 3,000 to upward of 10,000. The actual figure may never be known. And then the war ended, and American occupation authorities made a decision. General Douglas MacArthur and officials of the U.S. Army negotiated an agreement with Unit 731's commanders, including its head, Shiro Ishii, that granted full immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for the complete data produced by the program. The biological and epidemiological research, the frostbite data, the pressure studies, all of it was transferred to American military medical researchers. The Soviet Union, which had captured some Unit 731 personnel separately, prosecuted 12 members of the unit at the Khabarovsk war crimes trial in 1949. The United States dismissed the trial as Soviet propaganda. For decades, American officials denied any knowledge of a deal with Ishii. Ishii died in 1959, a free man in Tokyo. The data he provided has never been fully disclosed. Researchers who have sought it through Freedom of Information requests have encountered documents so heavily redacted they are, functionally, unreadable. What was purchased with immunity? What was learned from atrocity? What was quietly folded into the body of American military and medical knowledge? These questions do not have complete answers. They have only the weight of what we know was done, and the silence that has surrounded it ever since. In the immediate aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American military researchers found themselves in possession of something unprecedented: a large human population that had been exposed to nuclear radiation at varying distances and intensities, and that was now exhibiting the full spectrum of radiation-related injury. The medical and scientific opportunity, viewed from a purely clinical perspective, was extraordinary, and some researchers decided to take full advantage of it. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established in 1946, was framed publicly as a humanitarian medical effort. In practice, it was primarily a data collection operation. Survivors were examined, documented, and studied. What they were not always provided was treatment. Medical findings gathered from survivors were not systematically shared with Japanese physicians treating those same survivors. The commission was oriented toward understanding what radiation did to the human body, not toward alleviating its effects in the people it was studying. This pattern extended to the continental United States. Between 1945 and the early 1960s, American hospitals, universities, and military installations conducted hundreds of experiments involving the deliberate exposure of patients, many of them terminally ill, many of them poor, many of them belonging to racial minorities, to radioactive materials. Patients were injected with plutonium, uranium, and polonium. Some were told they were receiving treatments. Some were told nothing. Some signed consent forms that did not accurately describe what was being administered. The stated rationale was the need to understand how radioactive materials behaved in the human body, information deemed essential for the protection of workers in nuclear facilities and for the development of nuclear medicine. Some of the findings had legitimate medical applications, but the populations used to generate those findings were not the populations who would primarily benefit from them. The experiments continued across multiple presidential administrations through multiple wars at some of the most prestigious research institutions in the country. They were not fringe science. They were peer-reviewed, institutionally funded, and in many cases published, with the nature of the subject's consent status omitted or obscured. An advisory committee on human radiation experiments, convened by President Clinton in 1993, ultimately documented over 4,000 separate experiments involving radiation exposure of human subjects without full informed consent. 4,000. The committee's final report was thorough, sobering, and largely forgotten. The age of the atom produced wonders. It also produced a pattern of treating certain human lives as acceptable variables in equations whose answers would benefit others. The mathematics of that trade were never openly debated. The decision was made quietly in committees and memos and research proposals by people who believed the knowledge was worth the cost and who trusted that the cost would be paid by people without the power to object. Hiroe Onoda was not an experiment, but he was the outcome of one. The Japanese military during the Second World War invested heavily in the psychological conditioning of its soldiers, a program that went far beyond standard military training and into the deliberate restructuring of the individual's capacity to conceive of surrender. The concept of Gyokusai, literally shattered jewel, the honorable death in battle rather than capture, was not simply cultural. It was systematically reinforced through training protocols, through the ritual destruction of alternatives, through the creation of a psychological environment in which the option of laying down arms became, for many soldiers, genuinely unthinkable. The experiments in psychological conditioning conducted by the Japanese military, some in collaboration with academic researchers in psychology and psychiatry, were designed to produce soldiers who would continue fighting regardless of circumstance, regardless of odds, regardless of orders that contradicted the foundational command. The foundational command was, "Do not stop." Onoda was given orders in 1945 to continue guerrilla operations in the Philippines. His commanding officer left the jungle without ever formally relieving him of those orders, and Onoda continued for 29 years. He emerged from the Philippine jungle in 1974, still in uniform, still armed, still, in his own understanding, at war. The conflict he had been conditioned to fight had ended before most of the people he encountered in the jungle during those years had been born. He was not psychologically damaged in the way that term is usually applied to traumatized soldiers. He was functioning, coherent, tactically competent. He was, in the most disturbing sense, exactly what the conditioning had been designed to produce: a soldier who could not stop. The conditioning research that produced soldiers like Onoda, research into the elimination of psychological flexibility, into the creation of ideological states so rigid they could not be updated by evidence, was studied carefully by the Allied powers after the war. Questions about how compliance could be manufactured, how resistance to contrary information could be installed, how a human being could be made to continue in a course of action long after the rational basis for that action had dissolved. These were not discarded with Japan's surrender. They were added to a growing library of knowledge about what human minds could be made to do, a library whose contents have never been fully disclosed and whose applications have never been fully traced. Operation Sea Spray, Operation Large Area Coverage, Operation Autumn Harvest. Between 1949 and 1969, the United States military conducted over 200 open-air tests of biological and chemical agents over American cities, coastlines, and rural areas, exposing millions of civilians to substances that ranged from supposedly inert simulants to agents with documented pathogenic potential. The most extensively documented of these operations took place in September 1950, when the U.S. Navy used minesweepers to spray clouds of Serratia marcescens, a bacteria the military had classified as harmless, along the coast of San Francisco. The stated objective was to test how a biological weapon might disperse in an urban coastal environment and to estimate how many casualties a real attack might produce. The bacteria was selected on the assumption that it would not cause disease in healthy adults. In the weeks that followed, patients began appearing at San Francisco hospitals with a rare and serious urinary tract infection caused by Serratia marcescens, an organism almost never seen in clinical settings at that time. At least one man died. His family later sued the federal government, arguing that the Navy's deliberate release of the bacteria had caused his death. The case was ultimately dismissed, with the court ruling that the government could not be held liable for military decisions made in the interest of national security. The Navy did not dispute that it had released the bacteria. It disputed that the bacteria could have caused harm. In subsequent years, similar operations took place over Minneapolis, St. Louis, and other American cities, some involving the release of zinc-cadmium sulfide, a chemical compound later classified as a possible carcinogen, dispersed from aircraft over residential neighborhoods to simulate how radioactive fallout might spread. The populations beneath these experiments were not told. They were not asked. They went to work, sent their children to school, breathed the air, and had no way of knowing that they were, in some government researchers' notes, data points. The rationale was national security. The threat of Soviet biological attack was real, and the need to understand how such an attack might unfold was genuine. But the decision to use American civilians as unwitting subjects, to expose real people to real substances in order to answer hypothetical questions about hypothetical attacks, was never publicly debated. It was made in classified rooms by people whose names did not appear in newspapers and whose decisions shaped the health outcomes of millions of people who never knew to connect their illnesses to a morning fog rolling in off the bay. The Fernald State School in Massachusetts was founded in the 19th century as an institution for children with intellectual disabilities, a place, in the language of its era, for the feeble-minded. By the 1940s, it housed hundreds of children who, in many cases, had no diagnosed disability at all. Children who had been placed there by desperate families, by the courts, or by social systems that had no other place to put them. In 1946, researchers from MIT and Harvard, in collaboration with Quaker Oats and the Atomic Energy Commission, began a series of experiments using the children of Fernald as research subjects. The initial studies involved feeding children radioactive iron and calcium in their breakfast cereal. The stated scientific purpose was to study how the human digestive system absorbed these minerals, research that could, in principle, have nutritional applications. The children were not told what was in their food. Their parents, in some cases, were told only that their children were being invited to join a science club that would receive special privileges, including trips and extra food. The letters sent to parents did not mention radiation. The children drank the milk. They ate the cereal. They went about their days in the institution, unaware that researchers were measuring what their bodies were absorbing and what they were excreting, tracking the path of radioactive tracers through their digestive systems. Subsequent investigations revealed that the radiation doses involved, while relatively low, were administered to children who had no ability to consent and whose parents had been given information so incomplete as to be actively misleading. The children had been chosen, in part, precisely because they were institutionalized, because their lives were controlled by others, because they had no advocates who would demand full disclosure because the institutional setting made access easy and oversight minimal. Some of the children were still alive when the experiments were disclosed in the 1990s. Some had spent decades at Fernald and emerged into the world without understanding what had been done to them in those early years. The researchers, many of them distinguished academics from respected institutions, had not thought of themselves as doing anything wrong. They had been answering scientific questions. They had believed the risks were small. They had not considered, or had set aside, the question of what it meant to use people who could not refuse. In 1994, a class action lawsuit was settled. The settlement provided compensation. It provided acknowledgement. It did not provide what it could not provide, The years of choice that had been taken from children who had already been given so few. Operation Paperclip. The name has become familiar. The full weight of what it represented has not. Beginning in 1945, the United States military and intelligence apparatus conducted a systematic program of recruiting German scientists, including men who had participated in, designed, or directly benefited from the experiments of the Nazi regime, and bringing them to America. Their records were altered. Their affiliations were obscured. Their war crimes were reviewed and, in case after case, deemed acceptable given the scientific value the individuals represented. Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket program, came to America and became the father of NASA's Saturn V rocket. He was celebrated. He received the National Medal of Science. He was, in the public narrative, a visionary. The fact that the V-2 was built using forced labor from the Mittelwerk underground factory, where thousands of concentration camp prisoners worked in conditions deliberately designed to kill them, was a detail that the public narrative consistently minimized. Von Braun was not alone. Over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists were brought to the United States under Paperclip and related programs. Their expertise covered rocketry, aviation medicine, chemical weapons, biological research, and psychological operations. They were given security clearances, academic positions, military contracts, and, in many cases, American citizenship. The Soviet Union conducted its own parallel program, Operation Osoaviakhim, seizing German scientists and technical expertise for use in Soviet military research. The Cold War arms race was, in part, a competition between two powers to most effectively exploit the scientific capacity of a defeated nation. What Operation Paperclip represented was a decision made at the highest levels of the American government, approved by President Truman, implemented by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, that scientific knowledge and technical capability were more important than accountability, that the men who had helped design systems of mass murder could be rehabilitated, rebranded, and put to work, that the origin of their knowledge need not be examined too closely, provided the application served the right side. The scientists who came to America did not, in most cases, bring their experimental data in isolation. They brought the culture, the methodology, the institutional habits of a research environment in which human subjects were treated as expendable, and some of what they brought, the questions they had learned to ask, the methods they had learned to use, the threshold for what was considered acceptable in the pursuit of knowledge, became part of American science. The line between the experiments conducted in Germany before 1945 and the experiments conducted in America after 1945 is not a clean break. It is a continuation, altered in degree, but not always in kind, carried forward by men who changed their addresses and their allegiances, but not always their assumptions. The most dangerous thing Operation Paperclip imported was not the rocketry. It was the premise that science, in service of national power, had a different relationship to human life than science in any other context, that the calculations of progress and security could be made with variables that included people who had not agreed to be variables. That premise did not arrive from Germany. It already existed in America. Paperclip did not create it, but it confirmed it. It institutionalized it. It gave it new tools and new practitioners and another generation of classified programs in which human beings were studied, exposed, altered, and silenced. There is a version of history in which these programs are aberrations, extreme responses to extreme circumstances, decisions made by individuals operating outside the norms of their institutions, their nations, Their times? The evidence does not support that version. These programs were institutional. They were funded, reviewed, approved, and in many cases continued for years or decades. They were conducted by educated people, scientists, physicians, military officers, intelligence officials, who went home to their families afterward, who attended conferences, who published papers, who received promotions. What they shared was not a psychological profile of cruelty. What they shared was a conviction that knowledge, in the right hands, justified the cost of its acquisition, and that the determination of who bore that cost was a decision that those in power were entitled to make on behalf of those who were not. The war ended. The experiments did not immediately. The silence lasted longer than either. And somewhere between the silence and the partial disclosures, between the classified documents and the settled lawsuits and the presidential apologies that came decades after the harm, there is a question that does not resolve neatly into either condemnation or understanding. It is the question of what institutions do when they believe the stakes are high enough, of what any person or any government is willing to do when they have convinced themselves that the outcome justifies the method, of how the people making those decisions manage to look at the people bearing that cost, and to see, instead of a person, a variable. The war created conditions, but the conditions only revealed what was already possible, what human institutions under pressure are willing to become. That is not a historical question. It is a present one, and its answer depends not on what the past decided, but on what we are willing to insist upon now.